Woo, Miss Ammons, there's a lot of wildlife in here on the fourth grade hall. Poor Miss Mitchell. Where is Miss Mitchell?
She's still lost in the jungle.
She is. She's still lost in the jungle.
All right.
Hopefully she'll find her way back. All right, guys. We are here to help prepare you for your upcoming classifying organisms test. So if you would get out your interactive science notebooks so that you can follow along and help quiz yourself as we go along. So first thing we are going to talk about is let's talk about what classifying means. We talked about classifying different organisms. We talked about classifying plants. We talked about classifying animals. So what were we doing when we were doing all that classifying?
When I think about classifying, I think about you're trying to figure out sorting it or where it belongs. And it's usually you have different options. So is it this or this?
Okay, good. So a lot of times when we do this, we're putting the different organisms into groups based on characteristics that they have in common. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, so classifying means grouping things based on common characteristics. Very good.
Right.
Okay, so let's take a look. The first organisms we learned about were plants. So let's take a look at our plants and talk about, Miss Ammons, how do we classify plants? I know we can classify them in many ways, but we talked about just one specific way with this unit.
So all plants belong in one of two groups, either flowering plants or non-flowering plants, and non obviously meaning not flowering plants.
Very good.
So when I'm thinking about those two groups, I'm thinking about the big difference between the two are a couple different things. How they reproduce is kind of the big ding, 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 ding. So when I'm thinking about flowering plants, I'm thinking about grass and fruit trees and roses, any type of what we actually call a flower, because we know they produce seeds, and the new flowers come from seeds. Then non-flowering plants don't reproduce with seeds, but with something called spores, with the exception of there's a group called conifers, which we think of as like pine trees or a Christmas tree. They have cones that have the seeds inside of them.
Very good.
But other than that, non-flowering plants reproduce with spores, which we looked down the fern, we flipped the fern over, and we saw all those little dust particles, and that's what we consider spores, and that's how more non-flowering plants are created.
Very good. So what I told my class to help them kind of remember this, because there are so many different plant species out there, and you kind of get overwhelmed if you think about how am I going to classify them as a flowering or non-flowering. But if you remember these four groups of non-flowering plants: algae, mosses, ferns, and the conifers, then if you can remember those four things, then you know that any other plants that we talk about are going to be plants that produce flowers. Okay, so even like a carnivorous plant like a Venus flytrap or a pitcher plant, even though maybe you don't think about it when you first see them, you don't see a flower, they actually do produce a flower, and they are a flowering plant. It just only produces flowers at a certain time of year.
Right. And we talked about with fruit trees. Remember, with fruit trees, they're considered flowering plants. They reproduce with seeds, even though there's not an actual flower. Like when we think of like a rose, how we think of that as a flower with petals. The apple or the orange, that's considered the...
They do produce a flower, it just maybe the flower actually is going to end up producing the fruit. That's right. That's right. Okay, so let's talk about quickly those four different groups of non-flowering plants. We are starting with algae, and we talked about the fact that they do reproduce with spores. And an example of algae is seaweed, which is something we can find on the ocean.
Mm-hmm. And then when I'm thinking about moss, if you think about moss, you've probably seen it like near a swamp or maybe someplace in your yard that's usually damp. It stays really moist. That's what moss need in order to survive. And they also reproduce with spores.
Good. They're very low growing. They don't even really have roots. They're just kind of clumped together. Almost looks like a little green carpet.
And you can pull them off like they are on rocks a lot. You can just kind of rip the carpet off.
All right, and then ferns, we talked about earlier, and they have the feather-like leaves, And again, they produce by spores, and we had Miss Hammonds brought in that great example of the fern. We got to see the spore pockets on the back of the fern. And we know there's tiny little spores within each one of those pockets that help make new ferns.
Right, and then our last group of non-flowering plants are the conifers, and they're a little bit different than the algae, moss, and ferns because they don't have spores, but they have the seeds inside of their cones, and their leaves are actually needles. So think about pine needles, think about your Christmas tree that you may have and all the pine needles that you're sweeping up for months.
Yes, and think about conifer. Even though we don't necessarily call it conifer,
right,
you can kind of see that word cone within the word conifer.
That can definitely help you remember. All right, so when I'm thinking about plants surviving and growing, Miss McKnight, how is that possible? What process do they use? And then let's think about the 4 ingredients of that process.
Okay, so plants need 4 major things in order to survive. One thing they need is that big, beautiful, bright star that's close to our Earth, and it's called the sun, that provides light and heat to our Earth, so the plants need that. They also need air, and even more specifically, they need the carbon dioxide that we breathe out, they take in, and then they actually release oxygen that we breathe in. And then, of course, they need nutrients to help. They kind of take the nutrients either from soil, or sometimes some plants grow on tree bark or rocks or things like that, and they just take nutrients from where they live to help make and produce food. And then, of course, water. They need water in order to survive. All right, and then next, something really cool about plants is that they can make their own food. Sometimes I wish I could do that because I'm so hungry and I'm having to eat a Hershey's Kiss.
I wish I could make chocolate.
I can't just make it. I know. All right, so plants, they do this crazy process called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is where the plants take sun, the carbon dioxide from the air, nutrients and water from the soil or wherever they're growing, and they actually make a sugar or glucose. And then at the end of that process, they release oxygen, which of course is vital for us to survive and for animals to survive. So pretty much, even though plants maybe aren't as exciting as some of the animals that we learned about, without plants, there would be no animals, there would be no us, there would be no humans, there would be no life
at all
on Earth. So plants are super duper important.
Right. So that kind of sums up everything that we talked about with plants. So overall, remember, this is our classifying organisms unit. So if I have an organism and it's not a plant, that must mean it's an animal. So then within our animals, we have a question that we ask ourselves to figure out, just like with plants. It was either non-flowering or flowering. Ms. McKnight, what's that question that we ask ourselves that are our 2 big groups of animals?
All right, our 2 big groups have to do with their backbone. So whether an animal is a vertebrate, which is an animal with a backbone, or whether it's an invertebrate, which is an animal without a backbone. And then within each of those 2 groups are more groups, of course.
So many groups.
I know. So let's start with the vertebrates, all those animals with backbones. Let's take a look. Let's show this on our flip chart here. So we talked about this in class about whether or not there's more vertebrates or invertebrates on Earth, because we think a lot of times when we think about animals, we think about the vertebrate animals.
Right.
But if you think about some of the invertebrates, like insects, we know there are gazillions of them. So invertebrates actually
look how much.
are over 90% of the animal species on Earth.
That's so fascinating. I guess if you think about all the types of invertebrates live in the ocean too.
That's right.
There's how many?
There's tons.
Tons in there.
All right, so let's take a look at vertebrates. We have 5 different groups. We have fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. And this is another cool chart here where you can see the largest group of vertebrates is actually fish. And then it almost looks like birds and amphibians come next, and then reptiles, and then look at our mammal group is actually the smallest group of vertebrates.
So let's go through each group within the group of vertebrates and kind of talk about some of the distinguishing factors that make that organism considered that type of vertebrate. So first off, we have birds. We know birds are warm-blooded. Now let's talk about what we talked about, warm-blooded versus cold-blooded. So I'm thinking about us. We're a warm-blooded organism. That means that we have a consistent body temperature. That's how we can tell if we're running a fever, because normally humans, we have about 98.6 is our typical body temperature. When we go out to recess, even though you're getting super hot and sweaty, when you come back in, that doesn't mean that your body temperature has changed drastically. We have the same body temperature despite how our environment may change. Versus cold-blooded animals, some of the examples we're going to see in a minute, their environments do change their body temperature. So that's why in a little bit when we see some animals, why you see some animals out on rocks bathing in the sun, because they've got to warm their body temperature up. But birds are an example of warm-blooded organisms that their body temperature does not change very much, and they use energy from their food that they eat to help them keep that consistent body temperature. Alright, so when I'm thinking about birds, what do we know? We know that they lay eggs. We see those eggs in the nest that they build. We know that they have feathers and beaks and wings, and that most of them can fly with those wings, but not all of them. I'm thinking about poor old penguin and poor old ostrich that can't fly super well. They do have bones, obviously, but we talked about, think about, a bird can't be super heavy or else it wouldn't be capable of flying, so their bones are actually hollow. They don't have a lot inside their bones, so they're lighter and able to fly. Some of the examples we talked about: hawks, owls, bluebirds, penguins, robins, anything you may see flying around with feathers, beaks, and wings.
Very good. All right, let's take a look at our next group, which is, wrong button, sorry. Which is mammals. Again, this is our second warm-blooded group, and we only have two. So just birds and mammals are our only two warm-blooded groups. Mammals are grouped in this category based on certain characteristics, and those characteristics are: one, that they have hair or fur. Okay, most of them give live birth, and mothers nurse their babies with milk. And one other thing, which I don't have on here, which I probably need to add, is that they breathe with lungs, as do birds. Some examples of mammals, you can see lots of cute pictures here, but also we have wolf, bobcat, horse, giraffe, elephant, dolphin, whale, seal, sloth, monkey, squirrel. I obviously like seal because I put it back there again. Maybelle, which is my dog, and Scout, which is Miss Mitchell's dog. And then, of course, us, people, we are mammals. So a couple of these, the dolphin, whales, seals, walrus, are another marine mammal. So you might not even think about them as having fur, but they do have whiskers. The dolphins and whales do as when they are young. So that is their hair characteristic that helps to put them in this category. And remember, they live in the ocean, but they do use lungs to breathe. All right.
Excellent job.
Next up, let's take a look at our cold-blooded groups. We're going to start off with fish.
So fish. So remember, cold-blooded means they are not capable of controlling their body temperature. Changes based on their surroundings, based on their environment. So we know that fish live underwater. Therefore, they must have gills that enable them to breathe underwater. They can't have lungs like we have as mammals. They also have scales to protect them from their predators, and they don't have fingers that help them swim, or some of the cool swimming gear that y'all have. But what do you use? What do we call those things that we put on our feet if you're swimming to help us swim better in the pool? Fins. And that's what fish have to help them swim.
Excellent. All right, next up, I kind of got a little crazy with the different types of fish, but you don't need to know all those different categories. All right, next up, I'm going to kind of talk about these two categories together. We're going to talk about reptiles and amphibians. So let's take a look at this Venn diagram here. Things that reptiles and amphibians have in common: they are both obviously vertebrates. They are both cold-blooded. Okay, so again, their body temperature depends on the environment around them. How they are a little bit different: and reptiles breathe with lungs, and amphibians breathe with their lungs and sometimes through their skin. When reptiles lay eggs, they lay leathery eggs, and they lay their eggs on land, where amphibians have gel-like eggs, and they lay their eggs in water. When reptiles hatch out, they look like a small version of the adult, but amphibians go through a process called metamorphosis. So, like if you think of frogs and toads and salamanders, they actually come out as little tadpoles and eventually grow legs. Amphibians have very moist skin, where reptiles have scaly skin. Reptiles have, if they have toes, they have claws, and then where amphibians have more suction cup-like toes. The big important things that you need to know about reptiles and amphibians, different characteristics, that reptiles have scaly skin, they breathe through lungs, and they lay leathery eggs. In amphibians, the big things you need to know, they have moist skin, they lay gel-like eggs, and they breathe with their lungs in through their skin. Those are the important things. Some examples. Amphibians would be frogs, salamanders, toads, and newts. Where reptiles, some examples, turtles, alligators, snakes, my favorite, lizards, and crocodiles.
Excellent job, Miss McKnight.
All right. Next up, we're going to take a look at one of my favorite giant groups of invertebrates. So these are all animals without backbones.
And make sure before we jump to invertebrates, on your in your ISN, on the opposite side of your flip chart, I think for us it's page 27, there's a chart with all the different categories of the vertebrates and the different characteristics that make each organism either fall under one of those categories. Make sure you're familiar.
Let's look at it really quickly. Is that okay? We'll go over it really fast. So if you're looking at that vertebrates chart, okay, notice the title is vertebrates because all the animals are vertebrates.
All vertebrates.
So we're starting with birds. So what you should have checked off there are they breathe with lungs, they lay eggs, they're warm-blooded, and then their skin covering you should have written down feathers.
Exactly. For mammals, make sure you have checked that they breathe with their lungs, warm-blooded, thinking about us, and we're covered in hair, or other mammals are covered in fur.
Good. Fish would obviously breathe with gills. They do lay eggs. They are cold-blooded, and skin covering would be scales.
All right, then amphibians, we know, breathe with lungs. They lay eggs. They're cold-blooded, and they have moist skin.
Oh, sorry, I have mine switched.
Oh.
Okay, so you said amphibians. So reptiles breathe with lungs. They lay eggs. They're cold-blooded, and they have scaly skin.
Excellent. So make sure you could kind of quiz yourself. This is a good way to study. Kind of cover up maybe the category on the left and analyze the check marks and the skin coverings and see if you can remember what group of vertebrates that would be.
Yes. And I know we talked about some exceptions in there with some, like duck-billed platypus does lay eggs, and then some fish do give live birth. But overall, as long as you know what those are, we're good. All right, invertebrates. This, you basically just need to kind of be able to give some examples of invertebrates. So I'm just going to go through super fast. We have sponges, which are a type of invertebrate that lives in the ocean. We have a group called cnidarians, which include jellyfish and sea anemones and coral. We have a group called echinoderms, which include keyhole sea urchins and starfish and sea cucumbers and sea urchins. We have a group called mollusks, which include, these are all animals that are soft-bodied with shells, and they include scallop oysters and clams. Then we have whelks, lettered olives, moon snails, octopus, and squid. Remember, octopus and squid are those exceptions that actually have a shell within their body. The last group is the largest, which is the arthropod group. That includes insects, arachnids, crustaceans, and centipedes and millipedes. So here's some examples of those.
And insects are the largest group of invertebrates, right?
They are. The insects are the largest group of invertebrates. Arachnids, of course, are like spiders, ticks, and scorpions. Crustaceans are crab, shrimp, and lobster. Then we've got our centipedes and millipedes, which we talked about. And then our last group, of course, is worms. So we talked about different types of worms.
Remember when we came into Miss McKnight's room and think about all the stories that she shared and all the real life examples that you got to touch and we passed around, so keep those in mind too when you're thinking about examples, and you jotted down some good examples in your ISN too. So don't stress about having to know every kind of specific worm, just kind of a couple for each category of invertebrates.
Yes, and the last thing that we did was we learned how to use a dichotomous key, which is, again, a tool that scientists use to help classify different organisms. So remember, you just ask yes or no questions to kind of figure out what the animals are. So for example, if we're trying to figure out if it's a bird, we're going to say, okay, is it a plant or animal? It's an animal. We'll follow that down. Does it live in water, live underwater, on land, lives on land? Then we come down, does it have hair or feathers? It has feathers, so number 5 would be what a bird would be.
And if you're like me, when I have it, I like to use my finger to literally kind of trace
Follow through.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And let's see, anything else that you feel like we need to talk about?
I think that's good. Just practice your dichotomous key, kind of study that chart with the different types of vertebrates, and really be able to tell a couple of examples for invertebrates. But good luck studying. Have a wild time studying. Good luck.
Bye, guys.